By the spring of 1942, the British strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany was not just failing, it was on the verge of being declared a total catastrophe. For 2 years, the Royal Air Force, RAF, had been sending small formations of Wellington and Hampton bombers across the Channel under the cover of darkness, attempting to hit specific industrial targets like oil refineries and railway yards. The British public was fed propaganda newsreels showing pinpoint accuracy, but the secret reality inside the Air Ministry was grim. The infamous Butt Report, a statistical analysis of bombing photographs released in late 1941, revealed a shocking truth. Fewer than 1 in 3 British aircraft were dropping their bombs within 5 miles of the target. Over the smog-choked Ruhr Valley, that number dropped to 1 in 10. Essentially, the RAF was risking valuable crews and machines to bomb German cow pastures, while the German war machine continued to hum along almost entirely undisturbed. The strategic situation for Prime Minister Winston Churchill was becoming politically untenable. The Soviet Union, bearing the crushing weight of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, was screaming for a second front in the West to relieve the pressure. However, the Allies were years away from being ready to launch a D-Day-style invasion of France. The only weapon Britain had to strike directly at the German homeland was Bomber Command. But with the current results, there were voices in Parliament and the military establishment arguing that the bomber offensive should be scrapped entirely. They argued that the resources, aluminum, pilots, and fuel, should be diverted to the Navy to fight the U-boat menace in the Atlantic, or to the Army to defend North Africa. Bomber Command was facing an existential crisis. It had to prove that it could inflict decisive, war-altering damage, or it would be dismantled piece by piece. Into this atmosphere of failure and doubt stepped a new commander, Air Marshal Arthur "Bomber" Harris. Harris was a man of zero compromise and brutal efficiency. He looked at the precision bombing doctrine of the past and discarded it as a fantasy. In his view, the technology simply did not exist to hit a specific factory building at night while being shot at by flak. Harris proposed a chilling shift in strategy. If you can't hit the factory, you hit the city that houses the workers who run the factory. This was the doctrine of area bombing. But to make area bombing work, you couldn't just send 50 or 100 planes. The Germans could easily extinguish the fires and repair the damage. You needed to overwhelm the city's defenses and its fire services completely. You needed a sledgehammer so massive that the enemy couldn't pick up the pieces. The problem, however, was one of mathematics. In early 1942, Bomber Command simply did not have the numbers to deliver a knockout blow. On a good night, they could scrape together perhaps 300 or 400 serviceable aircraft from their frontline squadrons. This force was annoying to the Germans, but it was not existential. The Luftwaffe's night defenses, the Kammhuber Line, were sophisticated and effective. Radar-guided searchlights and night fighters were picking off the RAF bombers one by one. The German population, despite the air raid sirens, still felt relatively secure. They believed that the British were incapable of mounting a raid that could threaten the survival of a major city. The morale of the German civilian was still high, and the production of tanks and aircraft was actually increasing. Harris knew he needed a spectacle. He needed an operation that would shock the German High Command, revitalize British morale, and silence his critics in London. He conceived of a plan so audacious that his own staff initially thought he was joking. He wanted to put 1,000 bombers over a single German city in a single night. To put this in perspective, no air force in the history of warfare had ever launched a raid of that size. It was a logistical impossibility. The RAF didn't have 1,000 frontline bombers. To reach that number, Harris would have to cannibalize the entire organization, risking the very future of the Air Force on a single roll of the dice. This was the birth of Operation Millennium, a gamble that would either end the war or destroy Bomber Command forever. When Air Marshal Arthur Harris sat in his office at High Wycombe and looked at the readiness reports for May 1942, the math was depressing. Even by stripping every frontline squadron to the bone, including the weary crews of number 1, 3, 4, and 5 groups, he could only muster 416 serviceable aircraft. This was less than half of the magical 1,000 number he had promised to Prime Minister Churchill. To any rational commander, the operation was already dead in the water. A raid of 400 planes was substantial, yes, but it was not the tide of iron required to overwhelm the German defenses and create the psychological shockwave Harris envisioned. The deficit was enormous, and the clock was ticking. Harris realized that to reach his target, he would have to do the unthinkable. He would have to violate the sacred rule of military sustainability and raid the seed corn of the Royal Air Force. Harris turned his gaze to the operational training units, OTUs. These were the schools where young, inexperienced crews were taught the grim art of night flying and bomb aiming by veteran instructors who were resting between combat tours. The aircraft at these units were often war-weary Wellingtons and obsolete Whitleys, planes that had been retired from frontline service because they were too slow or too vulnerable. The crews were a mix of terrified students who had never flown over enemy territory and instructors who were too valuable to lose. To commit the OTUs to a combat mission was considered military heresy. If these planes were shot down, the RAF would lose not just its current fighting strength, but its future ability to train new pilots. It was the equivalent of a desperate gambler betting his house, his car, and his children's college fund on a single spin of the roulette wheel. Despite the fierce objections from his subordinates and the terrifying risks involved, Harris issued the order. The OTUs would fly. He demanded that every aircraft capable of lifting a bomb load and flying to Cologne and back be made ready. This order sent shockwaves through the training bases. Instructors, who thought they were safe for a few months, found themselves climbing back into their flight suits. Students, some of whom had only a few hours of night flying experience, were suddenly told they were going to participate in the largest air raid in human history. The desperation was palpable. Mechanics worked around the clock to patch up leaks in planes that should have been scrapped months ago. They fitted guns to unarmed trainers and loaded incendiaries into bomb bays that hadn't been opened in years. It was a mobilization of everything that could fly, a Dunkirk of the skies. However, Harris faced another hurdle, the politics of the British military. He had initially hoped for support from Coastal Command, the branch of the RAF tasked with hunting U-boats for the Navy. They had hundreds of bombers that could have easily pushed the total over the 1,000 mark. But the Admiralty, jealous of its resources and skeptical of Harris's area bombing theories, refused to release the aircraft. They argued that hunting submarines was more important than burning German cities. Harris was left furious and isolated. He was forced to scrape together every last machine from his own bomber command, including the heavy conversion units, HCUs, and flying training schools. It became a point of personal pride. He would reach 1,000 bombers alone, without the help of the Navy or the Army, even if he had to fly the planes himself. By late May, the motley armada was finally assembled. It was a strange and terrifying collection of aircraft. Alongside the modern heavy bombers, like the Halifax and the brand-new Lancaster, there were hundreds of twin-engine Wellingtons, Hamptons, and even the antiquated Armstrong-Whitworth Whitleys, flying coffins that were painfully slow and had been withdrawn from combat operations for good reason. The sheer logistical magnitude of preparing 1,047 aircraft was staggering. It required millions of gallons of high-octane fuel, thousands of tons of high-explosive and incendiary bombs, and an army of ground crews working until they collapsed from exhaustion. Harris had his 1,000 planes, but he had built his force on a foundation of sand. He was sending students and obsolete machines into the heart of the most heavily defended airspace in the world. If the German night fighters found them, it wouldn't be a battle, it would be a massacre. On the morning of May 30th, 1942, the tension in the underground operations room at High Wycombe was suffocating. Air Marshal Arthur Harris was staring at a weather map that refused to cooperate. His primary target, the port city of Hamburg, was shrouded in thick fog, making a visual bombing raid impossible. However, the secondary target, the ancient Rhineland city of Cologne, showed a slim window of clear skies under a bright full moon. Harris faced a decision that would define his career and the war: stand down and risk losing the borrowed training crews who had to return to their units, or launch the greatest air armada in history into marginal weather against a heavily defended target. At midday, Harris turned to his staff and uttered the single word that would seal the fate of a city: Cologne. The teletype machines began to clatter across 53 different airfields in England. The die was cast. Operation Millennium was a go. As twilight settled over the English countryside, the ground began to shake. It wasn't an earthquake, it was the simultaneous ignition of over 2,000 aircraft engines, Merlins, Hercules, and Pegasus radials roaring to life across the flatlands of Lincolnshire and East Anglia. The logistical choreography required to launch 1,047 bombers in such a short window was a miracle of organization. Air traffic control in 1942 was primitive, relying on signal lamps, flares, and precise timing watches. A single mistake, a single blown tire on a runway, or a collision in the gathering gloom could have caused a chain reaction of disasters before a single enemy shot was fired. Yet one by one, the heavy-laden beasts clawed their way into the air. The Wellingtons, the Stirlings, the Halifaxes, and the Manchesters lifted off, their bellies full of incendiaries and high explosives, forming a massive dark swarm that began to circle and assemble over the North Sea. The genius of Operation Millennium was not just the number of planes, but how they were flown. In previous years, RAF bombers flew to their targets in a broad front, scattered over hundreds of miles and several hours, allowing German night fighters to pick them off individually. Harris and his scientific advisors realized this was suicide. For this raid, they introduced the bomber stream tactic. All 1,047 aircraft were ordered to fly along a single narrow route, packed into a dense column only a few miles wide and separated by mere minutes. The goal was simple: mathematical saturation. The German air defense system, known as the Kammhuber Line, operated on a cellular basis, where one radar station guided one night fighter against one bomber at a time. By shoving 1,000 bombers through a single cell in 90 minutes, Harris calculated that the German defenses would be hopelessly overwhelmed. The fighters might shoot down 2 or 3 bombers, but the other 997 would get through. Inside the cockpits, the experience of flying in the stream was a terrifying mix of claustrophobia and awe. Usually, a night bomber crew felt alone in the dark void. But on this night, under the illumination of a bright moon, pilots looked out their plexiglass canopies and saw the silhouettes of hundreds of other aircraft surrounding them. It was a traffic jam in the sky. The risk of mid-air collision was higher than it had ever been. A moment of inattention, a drift in altitude, or a sudden turn could result in 2 friendly aircraft grinding into each other in a ball of flame. The inexperienced student crews, flying the slower training aircraft, struggled to keep pace with the frontline veterans in their newer machines. The air was turbulent with the wash of 1,000 propellers, buffeting the smaller planes as they fought to stay in formation. They were guided by the new G radio navigation system, a technological lifeline that kept the massive herd moving in the right direction toward the fiery beacon that Cologne was about to become. As the vanguard of the stream crossed the Dutch coast, the German radar operators sat in stunned disbelief. Their screens, usually showing a few isolated blips, suddenly erupted into a solid wall of light. The sheer volume of contacts made it impossible to distinguish individual targets. The meticulously organized Himmelbett defense system collapsed instantly. German night fighter controllers were shouting into their radios, trying to direct their pilots, but there were simply too many targets. A German pilot would vector onto a bomber, only to have 10 more fly past him while he was engaging. The aluminum river flowed relentlessly over the coastal defenses, taking losses from flak, but pushing forward with the unstoppable momentum of a tidal wave. The German defenses weren't being outfought, they were being drowned. The sky over Europe had changed forever. It was no longer a place for duels, but a highway for total war. At exactly 00:47 hours, on May 31st, 1942, the silence of the Rhineland night was shattered by the lead aircraft of the RAF's 1st and 3rd groups. These were the pathfinders of the operation, equipped with the top-secret G radio navigation system, tasked with marking the target for the massive herd following close behind. Unlike previous raids where bombs were scattered across miles of countryside, the G leaders dropped their flares with terrifying precision directly over the medieval center of Cologne. Within minutes, the dark city was illuminated by brilliant red and green marker flares hanging in the sky like chandeliers of doom. This was the signal for the first wave of heavy bombers, the Sterlings and the Halifaxes, to open their bay doors. They weren't dropping high explosives to knock down buildings. They were dropping thousands of incendiary stick bombs designed to turn the timber-framed houses of the old city into a self-sustaining furnace. The strategic genius and moral horror of Harris's plan lay in the specific composition of the bomb load. Of the 1,455 tons of ordnance carried that night, 2/3 were pure incendiaries. The logic was cold and industrial. High explosives could destroy a factory, but fire could destroy a city. The first wave dropped cookies, massive 4,000-pound blast bombs, specifically to blow out windows, strip roofs, and shatter water mains. This prepared the structures for the millions of magnesium and phosphorus incendiary sticks that followed. The shattered buildings acted like kindling, allowing the fires to take hold deep inside the structures where the volunteer fire brigades couldn't reach them. Within 20 minutes of the first flare, the center of Cologne was no longer a collection of individual fires. It was a single, roaring sheet of flame that was visible to pilots approaching from over 100 miles away. On the ground, the German civil defense system, which had been considered the best in the world, collapsed under the sheer weight of the attack. The air raid sirens had wailed their mournful warning, sending citizens into their cellars, but no one was prepared for the intensity of the 90-minute saturation. Usually, a raid of this magnitude would be spread over 4 or 5 hours, giving firefighters time to move from block to block. But Harris had compressed the timeline so drastically that new fires were starting faster than the old ones could even be reported, let alone extinguished. The streets became wind tunnels of superheated air as the fires sucked in oxygen, creating a localized weather system that uprooted trees and sucked people into the flames. The firefighters found their hoses dry because the water mains had been pulverized by the blockbuster bombs. They were helpless spectators to the destruction of their own city. For the German flak gunners, the night turned into a nightmare of confusion. The anti-aircraft defenses of Cologne were formidable, consisting of hundreds of 88-meter and 105-meter heavy guns supported by searchlights. In a normal raid, a searchlight would catch a bomber, cone it with 2 or 3 other lights, and the guns would focus on that single target. But on this night, the sky was so crowded with British aluminum that the radar operators were blinded by the noise on their screens. Searchlights would sweep the sky and catch 5, 6, or 10 bombers simultaneously. The gunners didn't know where to aim. They simply fired blindly into the bomber stream, putting up a box barrage of flak that filled the sky with shrapnel. It was a wall of steel, but the stream was a river of iron that flowed right through it. The defenses were overwhelmed, not by skill, but by pure brute quantity. From the cockpits of the RAF bombers, the scene below was both magnificent and terrifying. Pilots reported that the turbulence over the city was violent, caused not by the weather, but by the massive thermals of heat rising from the burning metropolis. Aircraft were tossed around like toys as they flew through the smoke of a dying city. The light from the fires was so intense that navigators could read their maps without using their cockpit lamps, and tail gunners could see the rivets on the wings of the planes flying next to them. It was a vision of hell brought to Earth. For the student crews in the later waves, flying their obsolete Wellingtons, the burning city served as a macabre lighthouse guiding them in. They didn't need G or complex navigation. They just had to fly toward the glow that looked like the sunrise, except it was in the wrong place and entirely the wrong color. Cologne was burning, and the night was still young. While the bomber stream was a stroke of strategic genius designed to overwhelm the German defenses, for the individual crews inside the cockpits, it was a terrifying exercise in chaotic congestion. Never before had so many aircraft occupied such a confined volume of airspace. Harris had compressed 1,047 bombers into a column that was only a few miles wide and a few thousand feet deep. The sky, usually a vast and lonely place for a night bomber, suddenly felt claustrophobic. Pilots flying the heavy four-engine Lancasters and Halifaxes found themselves constantly checking their windscreens, catching fleeting glimpses of dark shadows passing mere yards above or below them. The slipstream turbulence from hundreds of propellers churned the air into a violent ocean, tossing the smaller twin-engine Wellingtons and Hamptons around like leaves in a storm. The greatest fear for many crews that night was not the German flak, but the terrifying prospect of a mid-air collision with a friendly aircraft in the pitch black. The mix of aircraft types added a deadly layer of complexity to the stream's dynamics. The modern heavy bombers cruised at around 200 metoi, while the obsolete Whitleys and training Wellingtons struggled to maintain 130 metoi with a full bomb load. This created a constant, dangerous game of leapfrog in the dark. Faster aircraft were constantly overtaking slower ones, often with zero visibility until the very last second. A Lancaster pilot might pull up slightly to avoid flak, only to find the belly of a slow-moving Whitley filling his entire field of vision. Evasive maneuvers had to be violent and immediate, putting immense structural stress on airframes that were already overloaded with high explosives. The radio silence was absolute, meaning there was no way to warn the plane ahead or coordinate movements. It was a silent, high-speed highway where every driver was blindfolded and the lanes were constantly shifting. Inevitably, the laws of probability caught up with the stream. Across the dark skies of the Netherlands and the Rhineland, tragedy struck repeatedly as aircraft drifted into one another. In the confusion of the searchlights and the smoke, two bombers would merge into a single fireball, raining debris down on the cities below. These collisions were often instantaneous and fatal for all involved. There was no time to bail out. The impact of two 40-ton machines colliding at combined speeds of 300 mph simply disintegrated both airframes. For the crews flying nearby, the sight of a sudden, unexplained explosion in the air, without the characteristic puff of flak, was a sickening confirmation that they had just lost 12 comrades to a navigational error. The psychological toll of watching friendly collisions was immense, forcing pilots to fight the urge to break formation and spread out, which would have made them easy prey for the German night fighters. The student crews from the operational training units, OTUs, faced the brunt of this chaos. Many of these young men had never flown a 4-hour mission, let alone one into the heart of the Ruhr Valley. They were flying tired, war-weary aircraft that had been retired from frontline service, planes with engines that overheated, radios that didn't work, and gun turrets that jammed. Struggling to keep their sluggish machines in the stream, They were often pushed out of the protective box by the turbulence of the bigger bombers. Once separated from the main group, they became isolated targets for the prowling German Messerschmitt Bf-110Ns. The instructors flying with them had to balance the need to teach their students with the desperate need to survive. Every shadow was a potential enemy, and every flash of light was a potential collision. The fact that so many of these training crews held their course is a testament to a level of discipline that borders on the suicidal. By the time the stream reached the target area over Cologne, the congestion reached its peak. The airspace over the city was a kill box filled with diving bombers, falling bombs, exploding flak shells, and blinding searchlights. Pilots had to bomb through the smoke of previous waves, often having to orbit or make a second pass to identify the aiming point, which increased the risk of collision exponentially. Rear gunners, their nerves shredded by hours of staring into the dark, sometimes opened fire on friendly aircraft that drifted too close, mistaking the silhouette of a Halifax for a German fighter. It was a chaotic free-for-all, where the only rule was to drop the bombs and get out as fast as possible. The stream had worked, it had delivered the blow, but the cost was a sky filled with near misses and the silent, fiery deaths of men who collided not with the enemy, but with their own ambition to fill the sky with metal. The primary objective of the bomber stream was not merely to deliver bombs, but to mathematically break the German air defense network, and on the night of May 30th, that objective was achieved with devastating totality. The German defense system, the Kammhuber Line, was a sophisticated grid of radar stations and night fighter boxes designed to intercept a steady trickle of bombers. It operated on a principle of precision. One radar operator guided one night fighter to intercept one bomber. It was a system built for a duel, but Harris didn't send a duelist, he sent a stampede. When the stream hit the defensive line, the German radar screens didn't show individual blips. They were whiteout, with a solid corridor of interference. The carefully calibrated system of ground control interception became instantly useless. A controller could not vector a fighter onto a specific target when there were 500 targets occupying the same sector of sky simultaneously. The logic of the defense evaporated, leaving the most advanced air defense network in the world blind and impotent. For the German flak gunners on the ground, the raid was a descent into madness. The anti-aircraft batteries surrounding Cologne were accustomed to tracking individual formations, calculating altitude and speed to set their fuse timers. Faced with the 1,000 plan, the gunners found themselves staring at a sky that was literally wall-to-wall with enemy aircraft. The volume of noise was physically painful, a continuous roar of thousands of engines that drowned out the sound of their own cannons firing. The gun barrels grew so hot from the relentless rapid-fire barrages that they began to warp and glow cherry red in the darkness, forcing crews to pause or risk a breach explosion. They abandoned aimed fire entirely and resorted to box barrages, simply pumping shells into a designated cube of sky in the hope that something would fly into it. While they managed to bring down over 40 bombers, statistically, their response was a drop in the ocean. They were shooting at a river of aluminum with a garden hose. In the air, the Luftwaffe night fighter pilots experienced a unique form of frustration. Aces who were used to being hunters found themselves in a target-rich environment so dense it was actually dangerous to engage. A pilot might spot the exhaust flames of a Halifax and dive to attack, only to realize that 3 other bombers were crossing his flight path, or that his own flak batteries were firing indiscriminately into the melee. The radio channels, usually disciplined and precise, dissolved into a chaotic cacophony of shouting voices. Ground controllers, overwhelmed by the data, were screaming contradictory orders, or simply giving up and telling pilots to look out the window and shoot anything. The psychological impact on the German pilots was profound. They were flying the best night fighters in the world, equipped with the latest Liechtenstein radar, yet they felt powerless to stop the armada. They could shoot down one, maybe two, but the stream just kept flowing, indifferent to their efforts. Below the aerial battle, the civil defense infrastructure of Cologne was suffering a catastrophic systemic failure. The sheer density of the incendiary drops meant that fires were starting faster than the fire brigades could even answer the telephones. The water mains, shattered by the initial wave of 4,000-pound cookie blockbuster bombs, ran dry within the first hour. Firefighters were forced to pump water from the Rhine, but the hoses were often cut by falling debris or strafed by low-flying intruders. The command bunkers lost contact with their units as telephone lines melted in the heat. The city's expertly drilled air raid precautions, designed to handle a raid of 200 bombers, were simply swept away by the magnitude of 1,000. It wasn't a battle of firefighting anymore. It was a battle for survival. The realization dawned on the Gauleiter and the generals alike. There is no defense against saturation. If the enemy brings enough planes, the city dies. Ultimately, the collapse of the defenses on that night signaled the end of the happy time for the German home front. For years, Hermann Göring had boasted that his Luftwaffe could protect the Reich, famously claiming that if a single enemy bomb fell on Berlin, "You can call me Meyer." Operation Millennium exposed that promise as a hollow lie. The sight of 1,000 enemy aircraft operating with impunity over a major German city shattered the illusion of invulnerability. It proved that the German war machine, for all its tactical brilliance, could be defeated by sheer industrial weight. The Luftwaffe had not been outfought by better pilots. It had been smothered by a blanket of force so heavy that no amount of skill could lift it. The sky over Cologne didn't belong to the Reich anymore. For 90 terrifying minutes, it was British territory. As the last waves of the bomber stream turned their noses back toward England in the early hours of May 31st, the crews witnessed a spectacle that defied human comprehension. From an altitude of 15,000 feet, the city of Cologne was no longer a collection of streets and buildings. It was a single, pulsating wound of molten light. The fires were so intense that the glow could be seen by pilots crossing the Dutch coast over 150 miles away. For the British airmen, who had spent 2 years enduring the humiliation of the Blitz and the frustration of ineffective precision raids, this visual confirmation of destruction was a potent psychological turning point. It was the first time they had truly hit back with a force that matched the brutality of the Luftwaffe's attacks on London and Coventry. The sight of the burning Rhineland did not elicit pity in the hearts of the bomber crews. It elicited a grim, cold satisfaction. They had finally proven that the RAF was not a spent force, but a sleeping giant that had awakened with a sledgehammer in its hand. For the German population on the ground, the raid was a shattering collision with reality. For years, the Nazi propaganda machine had assured them that the Reich's air defenses were impenetrable, creating a false sense of security that allowed life in the cities to continue with a semblance of normalcy. Operation Millennium obliterated that illusion in 90 minutes. As the citizens of Cologne emerged from their cellars to find 600 acres of their city reduced to smoking rubble, the psychological fortress of the Third Reich began to crack. They realized that the war was no longer something happening in distant Russia or North Africa. It had arrived on their doorsteps with apocalyptic fury. The sheer scale of the attack, the noise of 1,000 engines and the endless cascade of incendiaries instilled a deep, primal fear that would haunt the German civilian population for the rest of the war. The terror that Harris intended to inflict had been delivered, and the message was clear: no one is safe, and the roof over your head is just kindling for the next firestorm. The raid also scored a massive propaganda victory for Winston Churchill and the Allied cause. The next morning, newspapers across the free world screamed the headline, 1,000 bombers over Cologne. It was the kind of unequivocal success that the Allies desperately needed to keep the Soviet Union in the war. Stalin had been demanding a second front to relieve the pressure on the Red Army, and while Britain could not yet invade France, Harris had provided a spectacular demonstration of Western power. It proved that Britain was committed to the total destruction of the Nazi war machine. The number 1,000 became a symbol of Allied industrial might, a promise that the production lines of Detroit and Manchester were finally outstripping the capacity of the Axis powers. For the first time, the British public felt that victory was not just a hope, but a mathematical inevitability. However, the moral impact cut both ways, hardening the resolve of the combatants and stripping away the last vestiges of chivalry from the air war. Before Cologne, there was still a lingering debate in British circles about the morality of targeting city centres. After Cologne, that debate was effectively silenced by the roar of success. The raid normalised the concept of area bombing, the deliberate targeting of civilian housing to dehouse the workforce and break enemy morale. The bomber crews, once viewed as knights of the air, engaging in precision duels, were now transformed into industrial workers of destruction. They accepted their role not as soldiers fighting soldiers, but as a strategic force fighting an entire nation. The fires of Cologne burned away the moral ambiguity of 1940 and replaced it with the total war doctrine of 1942. The enemy must be destroyed, root and branch, regardless of the collateral cost. In the corridors of power in Berlin, the raid caused a quiet panic that no amount of Goebbels' spin could suppress. The Luftwaffe leadership knew the terrifying truth. If the RAF could launch 1,000 bombers once, they could do it again. And if the Americans joined them, the numbers would only increase. The raid forced Germany to divert massive resources from the front lines to home defense. Thousands of 88mm anti-aircraft guns and hundreds of fighter aircraft were pulled back from Russia and North Africa to protect the German cities, weakening the Wehrmacht's offensive capabilities. Operation Millennium didn't just burn a city, it forced the Third Reich onto the defensive permanently. The psychological initiative had passed to the Allies. The German people looked up at the sky with a new understanding. The Luftwaffe didn't own the air anymore. The darkness belonged to Harris, and he had promised to reap the whirlwind. When the sun rose over England on May 31, 1942, the Royal Air Force had lost 41 aircraft, a casualty rate of just under 4%. In the grim calculus of Arthur Harris, this was a resounding victory. He had feared losses of up to 10% or even 15%, which would have decimated his training schools and broken the back of Bomber Command. Instead, the bomber stream tactic had proven its worth. By overwhelming the German radar defenses with sheer numbers, the RAF had saturated the enemy's ability to kill. The survival of 1,006 crews proved that the night sky was no longer a slaughterhouse for the British, but a viable battlefield where mass could defeat precision. Operation Millennium saved Bomber Command from political dissolution. Before this night, there were serious talks in London about diverting heavy bombers to naval patrols or scrapping the strategic offensive entirely. After Cologne, those voices fell silent. Harris had bought his force not just time, but an unshakable mandate to burn the heart out of the Third Reich. The raid on Cologne was not merely a military operation. It was the proof of concept for a new, terrifying form of warfare: the firestorm. The destruction of 600 acres of a major city in 90 minutes provided the blueprint for every major raid that followed. The combination of blockbuster high explosives to smash roofs and water mains, followed by millions of incendiaries to light the debris, became the standard operating procedure for the destruction of Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, and Berlin. The 1,000 Plan taught the Allies that a city is a living organism with a breaking point. If you hit it hard enough, fast enough, and with enough fire, you can overwhelm its immune system, the firefighters and civil defense, and cause it to die. Cologne was the laboratory where the science of urban annihilation was perfected, turning the bombing campaign from a series of annoying pinpricks into a systematic industrial process of erasure. Strategically, Operation Millennium forced the German High Command to make a fatal choice. They could no longer ignore the Western Front in the air. The shock of seeing 1,000 bombers over the Rhineland compelled Hitler and Goering to strip the Eastern Front and North Africa of their vital anti-aircraft guns and fighter squadrons. Thousands of 88mm cannons that could have been destroying Soviet T-34 tanks at Stalingrad were instead pointed at the sky over the Ruhr. Hundreds of Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters were pulled back to defend the homeland, leaving the German armies on the ground without air cover. This second front in the sky ground the Luftwaffe down in a war of attrition it could not win. The British had turned the air war into a consumption engine that ate up German resources at a rate that made victory on the ground impossible. For the men who flew the mission, the 1,000 raid became the defining moment of their service. The student pilots who survived the chaos returned to their training units with a newfound swagger and a dark wisdom. They had seen the elephant. They had flown into the mouth of hell and come back. The camaraderie forged in that crowded, turbulent sky created a distinct bomber command identity, a brotherhood of men who knew that their job was not to duel with other pilots, but to fly straight and level through a wall of flak to deliver a cargo of death. The raid stripped away the last vestiges of romanticism from the air war. There were no knights of the air over Cologne. There were only technicians of destruction operating a machine that was too big to fail. They understood that the war would not be won by bravery alone, but by the relentless application of overwhelming force. Ultimately, the legacy of May 30th, 1942, is the realization that total war has no limits. Operation Millennium crossed a psychological Rubicon. Once the world accepted that 1,000 bombers could be sent to burn a single city, the path to the atomic bomb was inevitable. It desensitized the commanders and the public to the scale of destruction, making the unthinkable acceptable in the pursuit of victory. The raid on Cologne remains a stark monument to the industrial capacity of the Allies and the ruthless determination of Arthur Harris. It was the night the British Empire decided to stop fighting with gloves on and started fighting with a sledgehammer. As the smoke drifted away from the cathedral spires of Cologne, it signaled to Berlin and the world that the wind had changed. The storm had arrived, and it would not stop blowing until the swastika was buried under the rubble of its own ambition.